Before we dive in, I'd like to ask a small favor. I'm pouring all my energy into reaching my goal of 1,000 subscribers, which means the world to me. Please, I'm asking you to hit that subscribe button. It's just a single click, but it gives me tremendous motivation to keep creating more videos. Thank you so much.
The entire dining room of the grand establishment fell into an absolute suffocating silence. One could have heard the sharp chime of a thin silver needle striking the pristine white marble floor beneath the feet of the elite. Julian Brookfield, the most sought-after billionaire bachelor in the entire state, had just uttered the most ridiculously cruel thing anyone could possibly conceive. He pointed a diamond-studded cufflink finger directly at the trembling waitress whose simple uniform was entirely soaked in expensive bubbling champagne. He sneered loudly, asking her if she truly expected him to forgive her clumsiness just because she uttered an apology. Then, with a cold, mocking laugh, he told her that if she could sing a complex classical aria perfectly, without a single mistake, he would marry her right then and there. The lavish room immediately erupted into a wave of cruel, mocking laughter from the wealthy patrons. His beautiful fiancée smiled with sheer malice, fully expecting the poor girl to burst into tears and run away in total humiliation. However, none of them had any idea who this young woman truly was beneath her cheap clothing. They did not know that the girl in the stained uniform was about to open her mouth and bring the most powerful man in the city to his very knees. This is the incredible story of Elena Vance, and the single beautiful song that changed the course of her entire existence. The Obsidian Vista was not merely a high-end restaurant. It was a theater of immense wealth and social cruelty. And on this particular evening, the upper-class audience was exceptionally ruthless. Massive crystal chandeliers dripped from the high ceilings like frozen tears, casting fractured, sparkling light upon the politicians, oil barons, and technology magnates who were busy dining on caviar that cost far more than a small family automobile. Elena Vance quietly adjusted the stiff collar of her cheap black uniform, feeling it scratch uncomfortably against her neck as a constant reminder of her low social standing. She was completely invisible here, a mere ghost gliding silently between the tables to refill water glasses, clear heavy silver plates, and absorb the casual, unthinking contempt of the urban elite. "Bring more wine to this table immediately." A sharp, demanding voice snapped from the center of the crowded room. Elena turned around quickly, keeping her gaze lowered respectfully, as she answered Miss Thorne, who sat at the central table, acting as the undisputed queen of the evening. Isabella Thorne wore a striking red silk dress that looked as though it had been poured directly over her slender body, and on her finger, a massive diamond sparkled heavily. Next to her sat the wealthy man who had purchased that ring, Julian Brookfield, the 33-year-old chief executive officer of Brookfield Dynamics, a man who could move entire financial markets with a single whisper. Tonight, however, Julian looked completely bored, staring down at his phone rather than listening to his fiancée complain about the specific garnish on her expensive lobster. "Julian, are you even paying attention to me?" Isabella hissed loudly, her perfectly manicured fingernails tapping sharply against the white linen tablecloth. "I said that the soprano singer you hired for our upcoming wedding is completely average, and I will absolutely not tolerate mediocrity at a Brookfield wedding." Julian sighed deeply, finally sliding his expensive phone into the pocket of his tailored tuxedo, before looking at her with dark, intelligent, and exhausted eyes. "Isabella, it is a wedding, not a royal coronation," Julian replied in a deep, calm voice. "Nobody is going to analyze the vocal technique of the singer while they are busy getting drunk on vintage champagne." "I will analyze it," Isabella countered icily, her eyes flashing with anger. Elena stepped closer to the table holding a bottle of deep red wine, her hands steady despite the fact that her heart was hammering wildly against her ribs. Being this close to Julian Brookfield was always deeply unsettling because of the intense, overwhelming strength of his presence. As Elena leaned forward carefully to pour the wine, another waiter rushed out of the busy kitchen and bumped hard against her shoulder. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion as the bottle slipped from her fingers, sending a large arc of dark red liquid splashing violently across Isabella's flawless red dress. "You incompetent little rat!" Isabella shrieked in absolute fury, jumping up so quickly that her chair shrieked loudly against the marble floor. "Look at what you have done to my custom gown!" Elena's face turned completely pale as she stammered out an apology, explaining that she had been bumped from behind. "I do not care about your pathetic excuses." Isabella roared, rubbing desperately at the stain with a cloth napkin, which only succeeded in making the dark spot look much worse. She then turned her immense rage fully onto Elena, her eyes burning with pure malice as she screamed for the manager to fire the girl and place her on a blacklist across the entire city. Marcus, the sweat-drenched salon manager, materialized instantly to apologize profusely to the wealthy couple, ordering Elena to go straight to the kitchen because her shift was officially over. Wait a single moment. A cool, solitary word cut through the chaotic noise like a sharp knife. Julian Brookfield remained seated comfortably, casually swirling the remaining wine in his own glass, with an unreadable expression on his handsome face. "Julian, do not interfere," Isabella hissed angrily. But Julian merely remarked that the wine actually matched the red silk perfectly, causing someone at a nearby table to muffle a sudden laugh. Isabella's face turned bright purple with rage as she demanded to know if he was actually defending a member of the low-wage waiting staff. Julian looked at Elena carefully for the very first time, noticing her frayed collar, her tired eyes, and the strands of brown hair falling from her messy bun. Yet, he also noticed that she was not crying. She stood completely upright with her jaw clenched in quiet defiance. "I am just saying," Julian drawled lazily, leaning back in his chair, "that firing her immediately is far too boring, and since we are celebrating our engagement, we should have a little bit of fun." "Fun?" Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the chatter of the room. Julian stood up, towering over her easily as he walked over to the small stage where a string quartet had just finished performing a light classical piece. On the wooden music stand lay an incredibly difficult piece of sheet music by Mozart, specifically the famous aria of the Queen of the Night, which the hired soprano had failed to sing properly earlier that evening. Julian picked up the sheet music, a cruel, sarcastic gleam appearing in his dark eyes as he decided to expose the complete absurdity of his fiancée's elitism. "I will tell you what," Julian announced loudly, his deep voice echoing clearly through the suddenly silent restaurant. "Isabella says you have absolutely no talent, but I believe that true talent can sometimes be found hidden away in the absolute dirtiest of places." He walked directly back to Elena and pressed the complicated music into her trembling hands, challenging her to sing the notoriously difficult piece. "This piece requires a remarkably high F note," Julian mocked, his voice dripping with dark sarcasm. "If you can actually sing this perfectly without screeching like a dying animal, I will personally ensure that Marcus does not fire you from your job tonight." He paused for a dramatic moment, a wicked smile curling his lips as he looked around at the shocked faces of the wealthy elite. He decided to raise the stakes to an impossible level, just to mock the false sanctity of his own shallow engagement. Furthermore, Julian proclaimed to the entire room, "If you perform this Mozart piece flawlessly, I will leave Isabella right here and marry you instead." The room gasped loudly in pure shock, and Isabella's mouth dropped open as she angrily told him that his joke was not funny at all. "I am completely serious," Julian lied smoothly, fixing his intense gaze on the pale waitress. "Come on, girl. Sing for your dinner, or sing for $1 billion. It was a cruel public jest meant to humiliate her, and everyone in the room waited for Elena to break down into tears, drop the paper, and run away into the kitchen. Elena looked down at the complex musical notes on the page, and the German words blurred slightly before her eyes. Der Holle Rachen kocht in meinem Herzen. She knew these notes perfectly. In fact, she knew them far better than she knew her own name. Elena slowly raised her head, completely ignoring the furious gaze of Isabella, and looked directly into Julian Brookfield's eyes. "Does the orchestra know the proper key for this piece?" she asked in a remarkably calm, steady voice. For a fraction of a second, Julian's arrogant smile faltered slightly in surprise. "Which key?" he asked, to which Elena firmly replied, "D minor, and I need to know if they can play it." The entire atmosphere in the Obsidian Vista shifted instantly from amused condescension to a confused, tense silence, as Julian blinked in disbelief. He had fully expected her to beg for her job or offer a stuttering apology, not demand a specific musical key from the professional musicians. "These are substitute musicians from the prestigious City Philharmonic," Julian answered slowly, his genuine curiosity finally aroused. Elena nodded once, and her cheap black shoes clicked loudly against the floor as she walked toward the stage. A small voice in her head screamed at her to stop, reminding her of the solemn promise she made to herself to never sing again after her life was ruined. She was supposed to be Elena Vance, the invisible waitress now, not the rising opera star she used to be. Yet, the burning humiliation inflicted by Isabella had awakened a fierce dragon that had been sleeping deeply inside her soul for 3 long years. She reached the grand piano, where the elderly pianist named Mr. Henderson looked up at her with immense pity, softly telling her that she did not have to do this. "D minor, Mr. Henderson," Elena said firmly, placing her hand on the smooth wood of the piano, as her trembling completely stopped. "A fast tempo, please. Do not wait for me, because I will keep up with you." Mr. Henderson hesitated, looking over at Julian, who gave a brief, sharp nod of approval before the pianist placed his experienced fingers onto the keys. The aggressive, turbulent opening chords of the famous aria erupted through the silent room, and Isabella crossed her arms with a smug grin, waiting for the horrible screeching to begin. Julian leaned casually against a marble pillar, swirling his drink as he waited for the absolute disaster to unfold so he could finally go home. Elena closed her eyes tightly, took one massive, deep breath, and then she opened her mouth. The very first note did not simply emerge. It exploded into the room like a spear of pure, crystal-clear sound that pierced the air with shocking power. Julian's glass froze halfway to his mouth as the immense volume and flawless operatic coloratura technique filled the space. This was absolutely not the thin, breathy voice of an amateur. It was a rich, dark, and terrifyingly precise operatic instrument. Her German diction was entirely flawless, and the emotion pouring from her was raw, unfiltered rage channeled through a lifetime of perfect classical training. Elena no longer looked like a tired waitress. Her posture had completely transformed into that of a queen, her spine like solid steel as her hands gestured gracefully through the air. The wealthy guests at the nearby tables slowly lowered their silver forks, their mouths hanging wide open in absolute astonishment. Then came the most difficult part of the piece, the legendary staccato run containing the high F notes that served as a graveyard for even the most experienced professional sopranos. Elena hit the first high note with the surgical precision of a laser, her voice resonating like a perfectly tuned bell. She navigated the intricate arpeggios with astonishing vocal dexterity, channeling 3 long years of scrubbing grimy floors and fading into the background, into a melody that demanded absolute command. Julian Brookfield felt a visceral shiver trace its way down his spine, the hairs on his arms prickling with gooseflesh. Having grown up attending lavish opera performances and with a grandmother who was a significant patron of the arts, he knew intimately what true brilliance sounded like. This was beyond merely good. It was world-class, an audacious feat accomplished by a woman in a stained apron and worn-out shoes. All her perceived physical shortcomings dissolved into insignificance, leaving only the sheer power emanating from her throat, a display of fierce, formidable beauty. Isabella Thorne had gone deathly pale, her smug smirk replaced by an expression of sheer terror, as she realized she was no longer looking at a servant, but a formidable adversary. Elena reached the aria's final, resolving cadence, sustaining the immense closing note with a lung capacity that defied all known medical reasoning. She allowed the magnificent sound to reverberate powerfully through the crystal chandeliers, until the very air in the room seemed to thrum, before abruptly cutting it off into an absolute void. A suffocating silence descended upon the room for a tense 5 seconds, during which no one dared to stir. Mr. Henderson stared down at the piano keys, his aged hands trembling with a potent mix of awe and emotion, while Elena stood on the stage, gasping for air as adrenaline coursed through her. Suddenly, the enormity of what she had just done washed over her, and she understood she had irrevocably exposed her hidden identity to the world. She glanced at Julian, who was no longer smiling or appearing bored. He was gazing at her with an intensity that made her knees feel weak. Slowly, Julian Brookfield began to applaud, his movements measured and rhythmic, and within moments, the city's entire affluent elite rose to their feet in a thunderous standing ovation. They had entirely forgotten she was merely waitstaff, completely disregarding the spilled wine as they cheered her on. Isabella stood frozen, a portrait of pure fury, violently gripping Julian's arm and urging him to stop applauding what she derisively called a trained circus animal. Julian coldly brushed her hand away without even looking at her, striding directly towards the stage like a predator stalking its prey. "Who in the world are you?" Julian inquired, his voice now raw, stripped of its customary smooth, aristocratic veneer. Elena instinctively recoiled, clutching her apron tightly as she murmured that she needed to return to her duties. "Our agreement was entirely serious," Julian stated firmly, stepping onto the stage until he was mere inches away from her. "I said that if you sang it perfectly, I would marry you." Elena met his gaze directly and replied, "And I believe we both understand, Mr. Brookfield, that wealthy men make promises they have no intention of keeping." With that, she turned and fled through the service doors, leaving him alone in the spotlight. Julian immediately instructed his head of security, Arthur, to ascertain her identity and bring her to his office the following morning, regardless of whether she had resigned. Meanwhile, Elena ran relentlessly until her lungs burned and the gleaming skyline of the affluent district gave way to the grimy brick facades of her own neighborhood. With trembling hands, she unlocked the peeling blue door of her cramped apartment and slid down against it onto the cold laminate floor. She had actually sung tonight, shattering her 3-year silence and resurrecting the phantom of Elena Vance, the former prodigy whose life had imploded in a single night. "Elena, is that you?" A soft, raspy voice called from the small bedroom. Elena gathered her composure, wiped down her stained uniform, and entered to find her younger brother, Leo, lying in bed, surrounded by medication bottles and a humming dialysis machine. He was dangerously pale, his skin almost translucent under the harsh overhead light, but his eyes shone with concern. Elena forced a brave smile, falsely claiming she had simply decided to quit her job that evening. Leo's eyes widened in alarm as he reminded her of the exorbitant rent and his life-sustaining medical treatments. "I'll find a new job tomorrow, even if I have to scrub toilets," Elena promised fiercely, stroking his hair. "I will get you that kidney transplant, Leo, I promise." Leo studied her closely, noticing she now bore a striking resemblance to her former self, before their mother's death, and before the monumental scandal had obliterated her opera career. The night her voice had fractured during her crucial conservatory audition because someone had maliciously drugged her water bottle, leading to whispers of drug abuse and instability that irrevocably tarnished her reputation. While Elena comforted her brother, Julian Brookfield sat in his opulent penthouse across town, gazing out at the city lights with a glass of scotch in his hand. Arthur entered the modern space and placed a slim beige file on the glass table, explaining that her real name was Elena Vance, age 24. He revealed that before her tenure as a waitress, she had been a top-tier scholarship student at the esteemed Juilliard School of Music. Julian's eyes narrowed as he read an old newspaper clipping detailing her sudden on-stage collapse and the subsequent rumors that had decimated her promising career. "She didn't fail because of pressure," Julian muttered, recalling the sheer steel in her voice at the restaurant. Arthur then delivered a stunning revelation. The malicious rumors had been traced directly back to a public relations firm wholly owned by Isabella Thorne's affluent family. Isabella had been a mediocre mezzo-soprano student at the exact same conservatory that year and had leveraged her family's immense wealth to crush a vastly more talented rival. A dark, chilling rage settled deep within Julian's chest as everything finally clicked into place. He looked down at the expensive engagement ring Isabella had hurled at him in a fit of pique in the car on the way home. The sole reason he had proposed was to appease his company's board of directors, who insisted he marry a stable, wealthy woman before his upcoming 33rd birthday to secure his inheritance. "Arthur, prepare the vehicle immediately," Julian ordered firmly, buttoning his tailored jacket. "We're driving straight to her apartment now." The heavy, authoritative knock at the door at 2 o'clock in the morning sent a jolt of terror through Elena, who grabbed a wooden baseball bat before cautiously approaching to inquire who was there. "Julian Brookfield," a deep voice responded through the wood, informing her he owned the building and demanding she open the door, or he would have security force the lock. Elena unchained the door slightly, and Julian stood in the shabby hallway, looking utterly out of place in his luxurious tuxedo. He refused to leave, threatening to discuss her brother's substantial medical debts right there in the hallway for all her neighbors to overhear if she didn't admit him. Elena opened the door fully, and they stood in her tiny, cramped kitchen as she angrily demanded to know his intentions. "Isabella is no longer my fiancée. I ended it an hour ago," Julian stated calmly, pacing the small room. He explained that according to his grandfather's stringent trust agreement, he was obligated to be legally married within the next 3 weeks, or the board would officially remove him as CEO. He admitted that his public challenge at the restaurant had begun as a cruel jest, but since she had perfectly fulfilled the condition, he was proposing a transaction. He required an intelligent, strong wife to play the role of Mrs. Brookfield for a single year to secure his company, after which they would quietly divorce. In exchange, he offered to immediately transfer Leo to a private wing of the finest hospital, engage the nation's top kidney specialists, and settle every single penny of her debts. Elena stared at him, recognizing it as a perilous pact with the devil, but the sound of her brother coughing in the next room amplified her desperation. "What are the exact conditions?" she whispered softly. Julian explained that they would marry secretly within 3 days, followed by a grand public wedding ceremony in 2 weeks to appease the press. She would reside in his luxurious penthouse, attend high-profile galas, and convince the world she was the woman who had utterly captured his heart. When Elena inquired if she would be compelled to sing, Julian hesitated before softly assuring her that she would only do so if she genuinely desired it. He then offered her a staggering sum of $10 million at the conclusion of the 1-year contract, entirely separate from her brother's medical expenses. Elena took a deep, shaky breath, looking at the powerful billionaire who had publicly humiliated her, yet was now extending the ultimate lifeline to save her brother's life. "Write down the contract immediately," Elena demanded, her eyes hardening into flint. "But I want a strict clause stating that we will have entirely separate bedrooms, because this is a business arrangement, and I am your employee, not your mistress." A flicker of genuine amusement and profound respect flashed in Julian's dark eyes as he agreed to her terms, noting that Isabella would have immediately thrown herself at his wealth. Elena spent a mere 10 minutes packing her meager belongings, stepped out of her past, and quietly entered the formidable world of the Brookfield family. 3 days later, the legal ceremony at the city registry office was swift, sterile, and witnessed only by Arthur to keep the press at bay. However, the true social upheaval commenced on the following Monday morning, when Elena stood within the vast walk-in closet of Julian's penthouse. She was no longer clad in a cheap waitress uniform. Instead, she wore a meticulously tailored marine blue blazer and elegant white trousers. Julian entered the room, stopping dead in his tracks as he saw her, completely forgetting the business transaction, as she looked utterly breathtaking. He handed her a pair of dark sunglasses, warning her that they were about to attend a major press conference to publicly announce their marriage. He also delivered a piece of alarming news, revealing that his formidable grandmother, the matriarch of the Brookfield family, was flying in directly from Paris. He explained that his grandmother controlled the entire family trust, harbored an absolute loathing for liars, and if she suspected for even a second that their marriage was a sham, the deal would be jeopardized. "You managed to conquer Mozart's most challenging aria," Julian remarked with a slight smirk as he opened the door for her. "I'm sure you can handle an elderly woman with a silver walking cane." Elena nervously adjusted her sunglasses as they stepped into the private elevator, and Julian gently took her hand in his skin feeling incredibly warm against hers. "The curtain is officially rising, Mrs. Brookfield," he whispered softly. As the elevator descended rapidly toward a literal shark tank of aggressive reporters and a rock-bottom Isabella Thorne, the elevator doors glided open at the lobby level, and the world outside instantly dissolved into a blinding flash of pure white light as hundreds of cameras erupted simultaneously. The deafening roar of questions from the chaotic throng of paparazzi was utterly overwhelming, but Julian guided Elena forward with an absolute calm. Elena felt her heart hammering violently, but she drew upon her years of classical training, reminding herself to maintain a flawless mask of aristocratic confidence. Julian raised his large hand, and the boisterous room instantly fell into complete silence, demonstrating the absolute authority he wielded over the city. He smoothly introduced Elena as the woman who had completely stolen his heart and the new Mrs. Brookfield, stepping back to let her speak into the microphone. "Good morning," Elena said, her highly trained resonant voice easily carrying to the furthest corners of the massive room without any effort. "I know you all have many questions." Suddenly, a shrill, furious voice interrupted from the side of the stage, as Isabella Thorne stormed forward, looking like a ravishing goddess in an expensive designer outfit. She bypassed the security line and held up a large, grainy photograph of Elena from 3 years ago, looking exhausted and ill as she left the hospital. "Tell them who you truly are, Julian's little darling," Isabella shrieked triumphantly to the flashing cameras. "This is Elena Vance, the disgraced conservatory dropout and addict who collapsed on stage because she could not handle the pressure." The entire room erupted into an absolute frenzy as reporters shouted brutal questions at Elena, asking if she had been in a drug rehabilitation clinic. Julian's jaw tightened in furious anger, and he immediately stepped forward to pull Elena away from the microphones, but she refused to move an inch. She looked at the old photograph, then looked directly at Isabella, realizing that the wealthy girl was acting out of pure, desperate malice. Elena stepped closer to the microphone, her voice ringing out with immense strength as she admitted her past name was indeed Elena Vance. And yes, 3 years ago, I was hospitalized. Elena continued firmly, her voice vibrating with controlled emotion. But it was not because of drugs. It was because someone maliciously slipped a powerful sedative into my water bottle on the night of my grand debut to ensure I would fail. She stared directly at Isabella, and the cameras immediately followed her gaze as the wealthy heiress turned completely pale with sudden fear. Elena passionately explained how she had spent 3 long years working multiple low-wage jobs to pay for her sick brother's medical care after her mother died of a broken heart trying to clear her name. "I am a waitress, and I am incredibly proud of that fact," Elena proclaimed boldly. "Because while people like Miss Thorne were busy buying dresses that cost more than my annual rent, I was busy learning exactly what it means to survive." She turned to look at Julian, who was staring at her with pure awe, before she told the press that if anyone had an issue with her past, they could discuss it directly with her husband. The stunned silence in the room was suddenly broken by a senior reporter from a major newspaper, who shouted out that this survival story was far better than any corporate business merger. The cameras began flashing wildly again, but the energy had completely transformed from judgment to absolute adoration for the beautiful, resilient Cinderella figure. Isabella stood frozen in absolute horror, realizing that her cruel public attack had accidentally handed Elena the ultimate public relations victory. Over the next 2 weeks, the luxurious penthouse became a whirlwind of wedding dress fittings, elite florists, and intense legal meetings regarding the upcoming public ceremony. Elena continued to sleep in the separate guest wing according to their strict contract, but the artificial boundaries between them began to blur significantly. They began sharing long breakfasts together, discussing complex global politics late into the night over cups of warm tea, and Julian quickly discovered that his new wife possessed a brilliant intellect. However, the ultimate test arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening when Julian's formidable grandmother, Genevieve Brookfield, finally arrived at the penthouse for a private dinner. Genevieve sat at the head of the long table, a zealous woman with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that could cut straight through glass. She used her silver walking cane to point aggressively at anything that displeased her, and so far, she had loudly criticized the soup, the American weather, and the floral arrangements. "So you are the singing waitress I have heard so much about," Genevieve remarked coldly, setting her silver spoon down with a loud clatter. She glared at Elena, demandingly asking if a girl from the slums truly believed she had the grace and competence to manage the massive Brookfield estate and handle the immense social pressure. Julian tried to intervene, but his grandmother sharply told him to remain quiet while she spoke directly to the young woman. Elena looked at the intimidating matriarch, instantly recognizing that Genevieve did not actually care about aristocratic birth, but rather about absolute competence. "I know that your tea is completely cold, madam," Elena said softly, causing the old woman to blink in absolute surprise. Elena calmly stood up from her chair, completely ignoring the servants, and walked over to the silver tea service on the side table. She explained that the water had been poured far too early, noting that the traditional Brookfield Earl Grey becomes incredibly bitter if left to steep too long. With smooth, highly practiced movements, Elena emptied the bitter liquid, brought the fresh kettle to a perfect boil, and prepared a flawless new pot of tea. She poured a fresh cup and placed it perfectly in front of Genevieve, ensuring the silver handle was facing exactly at the 3 o'clock position. "You are worried that I cannot handle the staff or the intricate details of this life," Elena said calmly as she took her seat again. "But madam, I have spent 3 long years serving the most demanding, arrogant people in this city, and I know how to anticipate a need before it is ever spoken aloud." She explained that a wealthy society dame simply assumes things will be done, whereas a professional waitress personally ensures that they are done perfectly. Genevieve stared down at the flawless cup of tea, took a slow, deliberate sip, and a long silence blanketed the tense dining room, while Julian held his breath. "The tea is absolutely perfect," Genevieve whispered softly, a genuine rare smile breaking through her strict, stony expression. She looked up at Elena, remarking that the girl possessed the hard-working hands of a laborer, but the proud, noble posture of a true queen. She tapped her cane loudly, declaring that Elena had survived the difficult dinner, which was an excellent start, allowing Julian to finally breathe a massive sigh of relief. Later that night, Elena stood out on the glass balcony, watching the heavy rain pelt against the city skyline, when she felt Julian's warm presence appear directly behind her. He praised her performance, noting that his grandmother had not complimented another human being since the late 90s. Elena turned around to face him, realizing he was standing far too close, the bright city lights reflecting beautifully in his dark, intense eyes. "I think you are a man who is entirely used to buying whatever he wants," Elena whispered, her voice trembling slightly as his fingers gently brushed against her cheek. Julian softly told her that when he heard her sing on that stage, it was the very first time in his entire life that he had ever felt something completely real. "Burn the contract," Julian whispered hoarsely, leaning his face down toward hers as Elena's heart completely betrayed her business rules. Their lips met in a passionate, hungry kiss that had absolutely nothing to do with the cameras or the business transaction. It was the explosive release of weeks of hidden attraction, and Elena kissed him back with the absolute passion of a grand operatic aria. However, the beautiful moment was suddenly shattered by the loud ringing of Julian's private phone, and his face turned entirely pale as he listened to Arthur's voice. "Someone broke into the law firm and stole the original copy of our prenuptial agreement," Julian announced in total horror. He explained that the stolen document contained the specific details of the $10 million payment, proving to the world that their marriage was a complete fraud. "If Isabella releases that document to the press, or to my grandmother," Julian said, his knuckles turning white, "I will lose my company, and you will look like a greedy gold digger." With the massive public wedding scheduled in just 2 days, panic began to rise. But Julian fiercely swore that they would go on the absolute offensive against Isabella. The public wedding of Julian Brookfield and Elena Vance was hailed by the media as the absolute social event of the decade. The historic downtown cathedral was completely packed with over 1,500 elite guests representing a literal sea of haute couture, old family money, and immense political power. Elena stood at the entrance of the massive, beautiful church, her arm tightly hooked into that of her brother, Leo, who looked healthier than he had in years thanks to Julian's medical team. She wore a stunning custom gown made of exquisite silk and French lace. But beneath the luxury fabric, her heart hammered like a terrified bird. They had still not located the stolen contract, and Elena knew with absolute certainty that Isabella was hiding in the crowd waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the massive pipe organ roared to life with the traditional wedding march, Elena took a deep breath and began walking down the long aisle toward the altar. Julian stood waiting for her in a flawless morning coat, his jaw tightly clenched, though his eyes burned with the same raw passion she had felt on the balcony. She finally reached the altar, and the archbishop began the traditional ceremony with immense gravity, his words washing over Elena like an unreal dream. Then came the fateful moment when the priest asked the congregation if anyone knew a legal reason why the couple should not be wed. The sharp, echoing click of high heels against the marble floor suddenly shattered the silence, as Isabella Thorne stepped out into the center aisle. She was wearing a blood-red designer outfit matching the exact color of the wine she had spilled, and she held the stolen beige folder high in her hand like a weapon. "This marriage is an absolute fraud," Isabella shrieked loudly, her malicious voice bouncing off the high stone ceilings as the media cameras began clicking furiously. She marched proudly up to the altar, loudly announcing to Genevieve Brookfield that the marriage was a cheap business transaction designed to deceive the board of directors. She pulled the stolen contract out and began reading Clause 4 aloud, exposing the $10 million payment and the agreement to cover Leo's medical bills. Total chaos immediately erupted inside the cathedral as reporters shouted. But Genevieve slowly stood up, causing the room to fall silent once again. The matriarch demanded to know if the accusations were true, and before Julian could formulate a clever corporate lie, Elena proudly stepped forward. "Yes, madam," Elena announced, her powerful operatic voice easily cutting through the tension of the room. "Every single word written in that contract is the absolute truth, because 3 weeks ago, I was completely drowning, and your grandson offered me a lifeline to save my dying brother." She boldly declared that she felt absolutely no shame in sacrificing her own pride to save the people she loved, causing the image of a greedy gold digger to instantly shatter. Elena then turned directly to Julian, taking his cold hands into her own as she looked deeply into his eyes, completely ignoring the 1,500 spectators. "We signed a contract for a fake performance," Elena whispered softly to him. "But somewhere between the press conference and the moment you kissed me on the balcony, I completely forgot my fake lines." She turned back to the shocked crowd, declaring that Julian was the first man who had ever challenged her to sing louder, instead of trying to silence her. She reached out, snatched the stolen contract from Isabella's frozen fingers, and violently ripped the $10 million agreement into tiny pieces, scattering them at her feet. "I do not want his money, and I officially terminate the contract right now," Elena proclaimed fiercely. "If you want to marry me, Julian Brookfield, you will marry Elena Vance with absolutely no deals and no financial timelines." Julian looked down at the shredded paper, then looked at Isabella, who was vibrating with fury because her ultimate trap had completely failed. A brilliant, genuine smile transformed Julian's handsome face as he stepped forward, grabbed Elena tightly by the waist, and pulled her close. "You are officially fired as my employee," Julian whispered hoarsely against her lips. "But I would love to permanently hire you as my wife because I love you, Elena." He kissed her passionately right there at the altar before God and the press, cementing their love to the world. Genevieve Brookfield smiled with genuine amusement, declaring that this was far more entertaining than a standard wedding. The matriarch remarked that a girl who could tear up $10 million in a church was dangerous enough to officially bear the Brookfield name, ordering the priest to quickly finish the ceremony. Julian then signaled Arthur, who stepped forward with a thick envelope containing the definitive proof of Isabella's malicious doping scandal from 3 years ago. Isabella recognized the documents instantly, turned pale as a ghost, and fled down the aisle in total disgrace, followed by a pack of eager reporters. The rest of the wedding ceremony passed in a beautiful, happy blur, and as they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Leo gave them a tearful thumbs up. Julian pulled Elena into a private alcove for a single quiet moment before they stepped out to face the roaring crowds of the city. He happily promised her a remarkably long, expensive honeymoon, followed by the purchase of her very own grand opera house. Elena had not only won the heart of the billionaire, but she had successfully reclaimed her beautiful voice, saved her brother's life, and proved that the greatest risks in life often bring the most magnificent rewards. The profound journey of Elena Vance reminds us that human worth can never be measured by temporary circumstances, financial standing, or the uniforms we are forced to wear. Life often tests our spirits through periods of intense obscurity, forcing us into roles that feel entirely beneath our true potential. Yet, it is precisely within those hidden valleys that our core character is forged into solid steel. True dignity does not arise from the wealth we possess or the social status we project to the world, but from the quiet resilience that refuses to be shattered by the cruelty of elitism and superficial judgments. When we hold on to our integrity during moments of absolute despair, we create a beautiful, silent strength that cannot be bought, sold, or diminished by the shallow opinions of those who measure humanity by material success. The unexpected intersection of two entirely different worlds demonstrates that genuine human connection requires us to entirely burn the artificial contracts and transactions we create to protect our hearts. True love and mutual respect cannot flourish within the rigid boundaries of legal agreements or social expectations. They demand absolute vulnerability, the courage to speak our truth openly, and the willingness to stand completely exposed before the world. We must learn to look past the stained aprons and the superficial flaws of those around us, recognizing that magnificent talent and noble souls are frequently found hidden in the most unassuming, hard-working places. Ultimately, life rewards those who have the immense courage to tear up the safety nets of financial security and predictable transactions in pursuit of something entirely authentic. When we choose to sacrifice our pride for the survival of the people we love, we are not diminishing ourselves. Rather, we are participating in the highest, most human form of nobility that exists. We must always remember to sing our truth loudly, especially when the world demands our absolute silence, because a single authentic voice has the incredible power to shatter the grandest illusions of wealth and bring the most powerful forces to their knees. Let us walk through our remaining years with the proud posture of those who have survived the storms, understanding that our scars are not symbols of shame, but beautiful medals of absolute resilience and unconditional love. True wealth is found in the freedom to reclaim our stolen voices, the health of our loved ones, and the profound realization that the most valuable things in this life can never be given a monetary price.